The KinHank mini PC called MP100 is a super tiny and energy-saving Windows PC that comes with around 60,000 pre-installed emulation retro games using the well-known app Retrobat and includes a wireless PlayStation 3-like game controller by GameSir. But today I would actually like to focus on the question if this console-like mini PC could also be used as a desktop PC replacement, because make no mistake, this little guy might be powerful enough, which is why I was testing it as my main PC for a few days. So let's talk about that.
This is Hubwood.
Now, there are a lot of videos out there reviewing the MP100 already, and when KinHank asked me if I wanted to test this little box, I was immediately thinking about what else you could do with it besides using the retro emulator part it comes with. But before we begin, let's have a quick look at the unboxing procedure so you can get a first impression. The current price for this unit is around $270 with discount codes, including Windows 11 and all the emulators and games pre-installed and ready to go. It's a real lightweight and comes in a full plastic body, though it looks subtle and feels well built and sturdy overall. Now let's have a quick look at what the actual hardware specs of this little machine are. It comes with an Intel N100 CPU with 4 Alder Lake cores, which can boost up to 3.4 GHz while using only around 6 to 12 watt, and it is including an Intel Iris Xe graphics unit with only 24 EUs. Furthermore, this mini PC is supported by 8 GB DDR5 4800 MHz RAM, which are soldered to its mainboard and unfortunately cannot be upgraded. It sports a SATA M.2 SSD with 256 GB, which includes an activated and pre-configured Windows 11 version and a 512 GB HDD containing the mentioned 60,000 retro games and the emulator app Retrobat. You can actually easily open up the MP100 to get access to the internals, which would allow you to change the used drives, while when doing so you would probably have to clone the disks first, as there is no installation or backup function included. And they also include an HDMI cable and a small 35-watt power adapter. The mini PC also supports Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, by the way. And while we're at it, let's quickly talk about the provided ports. On the front, it comes with 3 USB 2 ports and 1 USB 3 port with up to 5 GB per second, as well as a 3.5mm audio jack and the power button and a small hole for the reset button. On the back, we get an HDMI 2 port and a display port, 2 gigabit LAN ports and the power connector. And at the side, we are even getting a micro SD card slot. I have to point out that the relatively big USB transmitter for the included GameSir controller could block a second USB slot depending on your cables. And a quick word on the controller itself. It's a very light PlayStation-like wireless controller with an integrated battery, which is nice to have and gets the job done, but it can't compete with an actual PlayStation or Xbox controller in terms of quality and feel of the buttons and triggers. It's nice that they're including it at all though, making the whole idea of a gaming console more complete, I guess. And KinHank also includes a small bracket which allows you to install the MP100 on the VESA mount at the back of your monitor, which I wasn't able to do as I'm using a monitor arm for my monitors that block said VESA port. Now, to use the emulator part of the MP100, you'd simply have to open the Retrobat app on the desktop. So in any case, you would need some input like a mouse or a keyboard in the first place. And then you could of course enjoy the vast variety of pre-installed games from all kinds of systems, most likely including all of your favorite retro games on almost any system like the SNES, Neo Geo, all kinds of Ataris, etc. They even added some newer systems like the PlayStation 2 and 3 as well as the Wii U, while don't expect too many of the more recent titles and consoles to work in a playable way while Mario Kart 8 actually worked pretty fine once I've set it to 720p. But most of the 2D platformers and anything of the PlayStation 1 area and before should work flawlessly for the most part, while be aware that not every game is working perfectly fine, which isn't KinHank's fault, but it's a fact that not all retro games can be emulated in a satisfying way, even on much faster hardware. But as mentioned before, that's not why we're here today, so let's have a quick look at what this little mini PC can actually do for you besides that. Before we talk about the use cases and the performance, I want to mention that the MP100 only uses around 11 to 13 watt from the wall during lighter tasks and up to 28 watt on the full load, while the fan is always on and slightly hearable when it sits directly in front of you, but it's not too loud at all. Maybe comparable to the fan of a small laptop at its minimum speed, so no worries about that. For my extended test, I was setting it up with my two monitors, one of them being a 4K 60Hz screen via HDMI, and the other a WQHD 144Hz screen via DisplayPort, which seemed to be no problem for the MP100 at all. I also attached my keyboard via USB and used a wireless mouse. I also want to mention that there was no bloatware installed like at all. And I also thoroughly checked the system for Trojans and viruses, and it was completely clean. So I first measured the speed of the included 256GB M.2 SATA SSD, which resulted in around 490 megabytes per second for the reading and 444 megabytes for the writing speed, which is almost as good as it gets for SATA SSDs. The SATA SSD also allows the system to boot up in only 25 seconds from being completely turned off until Google Chrome was open and ready. Connecting my external M.2 NVMe SSD resulted in slightly less than 5 GB per second with around 432 megabytes per second reading speed and 410 megabytes per second writing speed, with the overall score being quite a bit slower than the internal drive, but surely fast enough for anything you would actually need it for. The microSD card / TF card slot was quite slow with around 25 to 30 megabytes per second for reading and writing, even with a faster U3 class card, though I guess it's better having a slow one than not having one at all. The Wi-Fi module reported to be connected with over 800 megabits, while actually measuring the download speed resulted in only around 600 megabit, while we would of course get the full speed when actually using 1 or 2 gigabyte LAN cables, if your network or internet connection could handle that. So the MP100 would surely be fine to serve as a personal home server of any kind as well, considering the low power draw on lighter tasks. I also fired up PC Mark 10, which resulted in up to 2,799 points, which is surely not a lot compared to recent laptops or let alone faster desktop PCs, but especially the essential score was pretty high with over 6,500 points, meaning everyday tasks like browsing the web, opening files and apps, watching videos, etc. works flawlessly. So if you're not really playing newer games and only need a PC for lighter stuff, this is actually going to work just fine, considering it's Windows 11 compatible and will be supported with updates for years to come. In Cinebench R15 I was getting 414 points for the multi-core and 146 points for the single core, which is basically what you would probably get with a 100 watt Intel i5 from like 10 to 12 years ago. And for Cinebench R23 that was 2,471 points for the multi and 899 points for the single core score. While for Geekbench I saw 3,136 for the multi-core and 1,190 for the single core scores. Now, as mentioned before, watching movies on Netflix etc. works just perfectly fine. You can even watch 4K content with a 4K monitor on YouTube, which feels fluid, though when measured there are actually some dropped FPS as it seems, while it wasn't too bad and I didn't really mind. Now I also tried some Full HD video editing with Premiere Pro with one of my own smaller YouTube projects, which worked surprisingly well actually. Even scrubbing the timeline and real-time playback with color grading activated seemed to be absolutely doable, and actually rendering the final project wasn't that slow with around 10 minutes, whereas my workstation is only around twice as fast with that project. But of course the 8GB RAM would be a limiting factor in more complex projects, or let alone 4K editing. Also, basic Photoshop stuff is of course going to be okay as long as you're not planning to work with too fancy or too big PSD files. And even some very basic Blender usage would work as long as you're using reasonable projects and focus on the actual building of the scenes, while of course rendering or real-time rendering in cycles wouldn't be any fun. But of course, no one would expect that from a cheap mini PC with a low-power 4-core CPU without a dedicated GPU. And last but not least, you can even play some lighter and older Windows games on the MP100 if you're not shooting too high and have some kind of backlog with older PC games. And I've actually tested some games and recorded them with my external capture card, so we can have a quick look at that as well.
Rocket League was playable with around 60 FPS on 720p and low settings, while there have been some smaller stutters here and there due to the CPU being the bottleneck, as you can see, since it's fully utilized in that case, though I'd consider it to be acceptable if you're not too eager about it. BioShock Remastered was working perfectly fine at 720p with low settings, with somewhere between 60 and 100 FPS. You could probably even crank up the graphics a bit for that one. I don't personally play Dota 2, so I was watching a live match using 1080p for the resolution at low settings, which seemed to be okay with around 55 to 65 FPS for the most part, so I guess that would be doable as well. Though CS2 at 720p with low settings is CPU bottlenecking so hard it's basically unplayable with around 25 to 40 FPS, while it stutters a lot, so don't mind downloading that if you're using an Intel N100, I guess. Civilization 5 is a great game and perfectly playable on the MP100 with over 40 FPS at 1080p and medium settings, while the turn times weren't even that bad. Very comparable to my experience of the game when it was released on the system I had back in those days. Diablo Immortal is kinda playable with around 30 FPS using 720p and low settings, with a few dips and stutters here and there, especially in cities with people hanging around, but doable. In case you wonder, Diablo 4 isn't playable even on the lowest preset with resolution scaling, it's just too stuttery for the N100. The beautiful side-scroller Trine 2 was working great though at 720p with medium settings with over 60 FPS, so cranking it up to 900p or using higher settings could work here as well. I was also quickly testing LEGO Fortnite at 720p and the performance mode on low settings for the video footage as seen here, and it was actually playable with over 30 FPS as well, while having some stutters here and there, but you could surely play it like that if you wanted to. And yes, it can run Crysis at 720p and medium settings with around 40 to 60 FPS most of the time, while I had some issues getting it to run at full screen and had to fiddle around quite a bit until I got it started.
Now that's almost the end of this video, and what can I say? If you're considering using the KinHank MP100 mini PC as a PC for everyday tasks, while not being too ambitious about having the latest PC hardware, you could absolutely go for it. It will do a good job actually. Now, you could of course get a cheap old used i5 PC or something like that for less money, but keep in mind that these usually do not support Windows 11. And Windows 10 won't be supported with updates much longer. Also consider the little amount of energy this thing uses and the tiny size. One could certainly use it as a server or a living room PC attached to a TV as well, of course. I mean, it's cool and it was fun to use it as my PC for a few days actually. It's always nice to see weaker hardware getting the job done as well. If I would have to point out its major flaws, I would have wished for more than only one USB 3 ports and the possibility to upgrade the RAM to at least 16 GB. And also resetting the PC could become a bit tricky, as this would delete the pre-installed Windows setup and Retrobat, I guess. And that's all for today. If you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel as well, as I'm also planning to test some very beefy mini PCs in the near future. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.